Whatever happened to Jesus? I want us to go back in our minds and through the Bible. I want us to go back 2,000 years to those events that took place over that first Easter weekend. We know that Jesus was crucified. The Jewish authorities made sure that they had plenty of charges against Jesus. I mean, they made up lies about him, but they made up convincing lies. Now, the Jewish authorities couldn't actually crucify Jesus. They weren't allowed to do that. So they handed Jesus over to the Romans, and the Roman soldiers were allowed to do executions. And so it was the Roman soldiers, having come before the Roman governor, brought their false witnesses, and then said, you see, this man, he's done this and he's done that and he's done the other. All false things they said about Jesus. And finally, as I won't go through all the details again this morning, but finally, Pilate, probably most of us know that name, Pilate, agreed that Jesus should be crucified. He tried to get out of it himself. He tried to push the blame onto others, but ultimately he is responsible as well. And so Jesus hung upon that cross. It was a very painful, a very cruel death that Jesus died on that Friday. And Jesus, after a few hours of hanging upon that cross, died. And the Roman soldiers made absolutely certain that he was dead. Can anyone remember how they made certain that Jesus was definitely dead, that he hadn't fainted, that he wasn't pretending to be dead? How did they make sure that he was dead? Can anyone remember what they did to Jesus? Just to be sure that he was dead. Sheehan might have an answer. What do you think? Yeah. So Sheehan said they hung him on a cross, they put a crown of thorns on him, and then when he was dead, what did the soldiers do to him? Can you remember? They came and did something to Jesus, just to prove that he was dead. What did they do to him? Hannah? They put a spear into his side. Oh, sorry about all the gruesome, gory details this morning. This isn't what you came for, is it? But they put a spear into his side, and the spear would have gone right in and pierced his heart, just to make sure he was definitely 100% dead. And then some nice people came along, and they said, can we have Jesus' body? Because we want to bury it properly. And they put him into a tomb, something similar to what we've got here. It would have been rocks, hollowed out, cut out like a cave. And into the tomb they put Jesus. And then they put a great big stone over the front of the tomb so that nobody could get in. And just to make sure, the Jewish authorities said to the Romans, we heard that he said that he's going to come back to life again. Therefore, we want you to make absolutely certain that nobody can pretend Jesus has come back to life. No one can say that he's come out of that grave. We want you to put some Roman soldiers in front of the tomb. And so that's exactly what happened. They put some guards to stand in front of the tomb and make sure that nobody opened that grave and took Jesus out. The thing is that by Sunday morning, Jesus had come out. So I'm asking this question: whatever happened to Jesus? There are three stories that I want you to consider. Three possibilities of what happened to Jesus. The first one is the story that the guards were paid to circulate, to tell other people. If anybody asks you guards what happened to Jesus, this is what you are to tell them. His disciples came in the night. It was pitch black. They crept very quietly. And unfortunately, because it was in the middle of the night, we were really tired and fell asleep. And then while we were asleep, his disciples came and they rolled that great big heavy stone out of the way. They went inside the tomb, they took the body of Jesus and they carried it away and said that he had come back to life again. That's story number one. Story number two. Story number two is the one that Mary, we've seen Mary up on stage this morning. But Mary, now there are lots of Marys in the Bible, so it can get very confusing because Jesus' mother was called Mary. And then the one that we had today is called Mary, sometimes known as Magdalene. And she was a friend of Jesus. And she had known Jesus for a few years and she travelled around with him and helped him. And Mary, when she realised that Jesus wasn't there, she met someone whom she thought was the gardener. So let's go with that idea for a moment. Let's suppose that idea number two is what happened to Jesus. The gardener came along and said, he shouldn't be in this tomb, I'm going to put him somewhere else. Opened up the tomb, took the body out, and put the body into another tomb, say. Okay, so that's number two. So what about Mary? Because Mary says that she saw Jesus, but let's suppose that Mary only thought she saw Jesus. Sometimes, you know, when people are very distraught and upset, particularly when they've lost somebody through death, their mind plays tricks on them. So maybe she was confused, thinking that she'd seen Jesus. But actually it really was the gardener who took him away. Okay, that's possibility number two. Possibility number three that I want you to consider is that an angel came down from heaven causing a huge earthquake. The angel then rolled the stone away, sat on top of the stone, just to show that Jesus was no longer in the grave. Then, the angel, or possibly more than one angel, because we read that inside there were two angels, the angel spoke and told, firstly, Mary, and other women too perhaps, to go and tell his disciples that Jesus is alive. Secondly, soldiers saw the angel themselves and were so fearful, trembling as a result of what they saw, but were told to tell lies about what they had actually seen. Also, that very night, Jesus appeared to all of his disciples together, except for one. Thomas wasn't there. And the following week, Jesus appeared to all his disciples again, Thomas being present. And by the way, they were in a locked room and Jesus just walked straight through the wall to see them. That must have been pretty unnerving. And then Jesus appeared to his disciples many times on separate occasions over the next 40 days. At one time, he even appeared to 500 people who all witnessed that Jesus was alive. So we've got three stories. The guards fell asleep and his disciples stole the body. The gardener moved the body and put it into another tomb. And Jesus actually rose and appeared, and angels came, and earthquakes happened, and he walked through walls, and he transported himself, and all sorts of things happened like that. Which is the most believable of those three stories? 1, 2, or 3? What do you think? Which is the most likely story to have happened? What do you think, Sheehan? 3. You're a man of faith, aren't you? So, okay, number 3. So Sheehan thinks that's the most likely, plausible story. Anybody want to disagree with that? What do you think, Rachel? You agree with him? Okay. Anybody else? Hannah?
Number 1 is the most likely, but it didn't actually happen.
Okay, so number 1 is the most likely, that his body was actually stolen. Sounds the most convincing. I mean, imagine you were telling this to somebody who'd never heard about Jesus before. And you gave them, or let's change the story again. Suppose that somebody who'd never heard about Jesus, or at least if they'd heard about him, they didn't know about his resurrection, they didn't know about him coming back to life. And for the first time, 3 separate people came up to them, and each of them giving their stories, those 3 stories. Which one are they most likely to believe? That's the question we're asking, isn't it? How many of you, and everybody can answer this, let's have a show of hands, how many of you think in that situation that the person would actually believe story number 3? How many of you think that perhaps story number 2 they might believe? The gardener moved the body. Yeah, they might believe that. How many of you think that perhaps the disciples stole the body? Might be a more convincing argument. Anyone think that that's what they might believe? Yeah, I think we've got a few more hands going up there. Okay, for that one. You see, actually, truth can indeed sometimes be stranger than fiction, as we say. Because the most unlikely story of all, we believe to be the truth. But I want to give you another reason to believe that that's the truth. Perhaps even more than one reason. If Jesus' disciples wanted to convince everyone that Jesus, who let's suppose Jesus was still dead, had actually been risen from the dead, raised from the dead, I don't think they would have come up with a story about angels appearing, moving the stone, about Jesus appearing to them, walking through walls. I don't think they would have come up with a story like that. I think they would have come up with something a bit more realistic. I think they might have said something like this. We went to the tomb early in the morning, and as we were there, we heard this noise coming from inside the tomb. And we listened carefully and we thought, well, are we hearing things? But as we listened, it was Jesus shouting, "Help! Help! Let me out!" And so we moved the stone, and there was Jesus. And he'd come back to life again. I think that would be more convincing. But you see, the thing is that actually, right from the first day that Jesus rose back to life again, people started to make up stories to suit their own convenience. And the thing is that even to this very day, people still make up stories to try and get round the truth of what happened to Jesus. Modern stories today will include, well, all sorts of things. There are some who claim, well, of course, Jesus wasn't actually dead, he'd fainted. He'd lost so much blood that he appeared to be dead. And then when they put him inside the tomb, he was actually really alive, and then he came round a bit later on. But then, of course, we don't understand, what about that soldier that made sure he was dead? We trust that the soldier knew what he was doing. And in actual fact, we know there's a little detail that tells us that when the soldier pierced Jesus' side, the blood and water flowed out separately, and we know that only happens when people die. It doesn't happen to a person who's alive. Also, I think that sometimes people say, well, of course, Jesus didn't literally rise from the dead. I mean, he stayed in the tomb. You don't have to believe that he physically rose again. It's enough to believe that his spirit came back to life. That's another story that people use. But actually the Bible tells us quite different. It says it wasn't just Jesus' spiritual resurrection. It was a very physical resurrection that Jesus had. Then, of course, we have those who say, well, of course, these stories about Jesus are just that. They're just stories, that he wasn't real. As somebody's pointed out, there is actually more historical evidence to prove that Jesus walked on this earth than Julius Caesar did. And yet nobody doubts that Julius Caesar was a real person. When you start to look at it, actually what's happening is people are just trying to find other ways of getting round saying Jesus rose from the dead. And I'll put it to you that actually, unconvincing as the story may sound, as far-fetched as it may appear to be, that actually that's the truth. And if we believe that, if we believe that all the events of that weekend, that Jesus going to the cross was all part of God's plan, that God intended him to go onto that cross, even though he didn't deserve it, that God intended him to die, even though he shouldn't have done, and that on the third day that he was going to come back to life again, and that was all part of God's plan. If we believe all of that, and we know that therefore that means we also have hope. You see, we sometimes need to prove that something can be done. We were going through the books of the Bible earlier today, and the thing is that for some people you might look at that and say, oh, that's impossible. How can you possibly remember all of those books of the Bible? And as soon as one person does it, that proves that it is possible and can be done. Because Jesus came back to life again, that proves that it is possible for the dead to rise back to life again. What's more, not only that, but, well, let me share a story with you. I had a friend. He was an older man, and he came to faith in Jesus Christ quite late in life. I remember having a conversation with him one day, and he knew that he didn't have too many more years left on this planet. And he started to think about what was going to happen to him when his time finally came to die. Now, thankfully, he was a very old man, so, he'd lived a long life, and we thank God and praise him for that. But he said, when that day comes, he says, I want to be buried in the ground, and I'm not going to be cremated. And I said to him, do you have any particular reason why you want to be buried and not cremated? He said, yes, he said. He says, I believe, he says, I've read my Bible. He says, and I know, he said, that one day, he says, that Jesus is going to raise me back to life again. How is Jesus going to raise me back to life again if I'm a pile of ashes? That was his thinking. I said to him, suppose that you're in the ground for hundreds and hundreds of years before Jesus does that, and your body decays and rots away. What then? But he couldn't get it. And you see, that's the thing, isn't it? That people sometimes struggle to believe that God can do the absolute impossible. The point is that Jesus was clearly, unequivocally dead. They made sure of it. They put him through the most horrendous form of execution. And having done that, think about the build-up to it. I don't want to go through everything again, but just think about all that happened to him from his arrest. How he was beaten, flogged, torn apart, really. The crown of thorns we've mentioned. Bashed over the head. Lost so much blood. Hung upon a cross for many hours. blood draining from him, life draining out of him, finally pierced in the side. It was a convincing death. And the thing is, how does somebody come back to life from that? Also, I want you to think about this. Sometimes I've had to go and see people who've had a very bad time. I mean, really bad. I went to visit a friend one day who'd been involved in a very nasty car accident. He was battered around. He was cut. Bones had broken. He was in a pretty sorry state. And I went to see him in his hospital bed a couple of days after the accident had happened. I'd never seen him look so bad. Well, I'm pleased to say that a few months later, he was right again. Months, not days. Not 2 days. Jesus had suffered so greatly. How is it possible that he could get up on the Sunday morning and say, dust himself down and say, now let's carry on? You don't recover from something as brutal as he went through in 2 days. There is a miracle that's taken place. And so it is that we believe as Christians, as unbelievable as it may be, that Jesus has risen and is alive. And he's here by his Spirit today, that one day he's coming back again to this earth. And these are the things of the Christian faith, the beliefs that we rest on. And I want you to think about those this Easter day. And that when anyone ever says to you, Christianity, Christian beliefs, it's all a load of poppycock. You just remember, no matter how unbelievable it sounds, it is the unbelievable truth.